Good afternoon. I'm Tom Clark, the editor of Prospect magazine. The border zone between politics on the one hand and law on the other has become ever more lively, ever more contested for decades on end now. But indeed, you might not have noticed the increasing reach of judicial review, public law and human rights into public policy, precisely because it's unfolded so gradually. But over the last couple of years, with Brexit, the Great Prorogation Showdown, and then most recently, the criminalisation of much day-to-day life with the lockdown, we've seen that this borderland is territory that no concerned citizen can any longer safely ignore. And yet British journalism and public discourse has, in marked contrast to that in the United States, been slow to grapple with the interface between the legal and the political. So I'm delighted to on an event which can help to put that right. I'm hugely grateful to the generosity of Jones Day for getting behind this discussion, and I'm thrilled that we're doing so in partnership with the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. As we approach the 10th anniversary of the great Tom Bingham's death, the insights and the passion that judge felt for the rule of law becomes particularly urgent, because from the east of Europe to the United States and beyond, it's now under increasing pressure. Whether or not the rule of law is also under increasing pressure here in Britain is perhaps something we can discuss. Before handing over to our speakers, I should just say a brief word, if I may, about what we've been trying to do at Prospect to fill that gap in political and legal coverage. We continue to cover Brexit from every angle, of course, including the related constitutional convulsions, the legalities of the divorce process, and the possible read across to legally protected rights. And we've done in-depth cover stories about judges in the dock. We've got a regular law column by David Allen Green, and we run pieces and interviews with jurists and lawyers all the time. There's a special report, in fact, on legal services in our next issue. Right, let's not distract for now from today's event. I'm deliberately not going to double up and do double introductions for our speakers, splendid and distinguished as they are, because I'm going to let our main host for the session, Joshua Rosenberg, do that. He's better qualified than me. Before I hand over to him, though, let me just explain briefly why it is that we think he is the perfect Grand Inquisitor for this occasion. He's the UK's most distinguished legal journalist, an honorary QC, and his book, Enemies of the People, How Judges Shape Society, has recently been hailed in Prospect's pages as magisterial. So he knows this territory if anyone does. And Joshua, over to you, and I'd be delighted to hear from you about the other guests as well.
Well, Tom, many thanks for those kind words, and for the plug for my book. I'd like to thank you and Murray Hunt of the Bingham Centre for inviting me to chair this discussion today. The Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, to give it its full name, was set up a decade ago to take forward the work of Lord Bingham, who was a senior law lord and widely regarded as the greatest lawyer of his generation. He was the first to define the rule of law in his book of that name. And the Bingham Centre has made an important contribution to debates on the topic we're about to discuss. It'll also be scrutinising the government's plans for a commission on constitutional reform, which we're told will be announced shortly. And you can watch live tweets of this event if you follow at Bingham Centre, all one word. We just under an hour left today, and we have not just one but two retired judges lined up for you. My plan is to interview Lord Sumption for about 30 minutes. We'll then have 10 minutes with Judge Williams, who's joining us from Chicago, and that should leave a few minutes at the end for Lord Sumption to respond to Judge Williams and to questions from you, the audience. If you've sent in a question already, no need to repeat it. If not, please use the Q&A function, the button which you should find at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Now, our topic today is democracy and the rule of law. The first speaker is Lord Sumption, who tackled these issues in the BBC Reith lectures last year. His first lecture was called Law's Expanding Empire. And if he'll forgive me for trying to sum up 5 lectures in a single phrase, his thesis, I think, is that the judges have gone too far, encroaching on personal autonomy, intruding on issues that should be left to Parliament. He also argued that if we tried to reduce individual risk, we would end up reducing public liberty. And that's, I think, what he accuses the government of doing this year. So what we're asking today is whether democracy and the rule of law are both at risk. Lord Sumption is one of only, I think, 7 people to have been appointed direct from the bar to the highest court in the United Kingdom. He sat for almost 7 years until he reached retirement age at the end of 2018. He's well known as a distinguished medieval historian, and for the benefit of those unfamiliar with the intricacies of the British Constitution, I should explain that Lord Sumption does not have a seat in the House of Lords, but he does have a much more influential platform, which is the pages of Prospect. He wrote a broadside against the government for Prospect on coronavirus at the end of May. Now, Lord Sumption, thank you for joining us. I want to start with an article you wrote for the Sunday Times on the 5th of April, which was published just over a week after the lockdown regulations came into effect. You said the restrictions were an interference with our lives and our personal autonomy that is intolerable in a free society. You mentioned herd immunity, and you predicted the epidemic would burn itself out when a sufficient proportion of the population was exposed to the disease. You acknowledged that COVID-19 was dangerous for those with serious existing medical conditions, especially if they are old, but you wrote, the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary and the Prince of Wales, all of whom have caught it and are fine, represent the normal pattern. Now, it's true that your piece appeared a few hours before Boris Johnson was taken to hospital, but I pointed out in a piece published the following day there'd been evidence the previous week he was far from well. My piece appeared on the day the Prime Minister was taken into intensive care. At that point, more than 5,000 people had died of the virus in the UK, and if Boris Johnson hadn't received the very best care the health service had to offer, I think his name could well have been added to that list. Do you have any regrets about that piece?
Well, obviously it did badly affect Boris Johnson. I don't know enough about his underlying state of health to say why it did. But what is undoubtedly true, if you look at the statistics published in particular by the Office of National Statistics, is that his case is extremely untypical. The chances of your dying under the age of 60 are very small indeed.
But nevertheless, he wasn't fine. I don't want to bandy statistics because I'm sure you'll defeat me on that. But I just want to ask you this question. If you had been writing a judgment, you would have wanted to see the evidence about Boris Johnson's state of health. Shouldn't somebody who's now a newspaper columnist be equally sceptical of the message that Downing Street, which was putting out, which was that he was fine, when he very clearly wasn't?
Well, I had no idea, other than what Downing Street said, about whether he was fine or not. Perhaps you're right in saying one shouldn't believe government statements quite so readily. There are plenty of others that I have not believed.
Because you're obviously writing as a former Supreme Court judge, that gives your views added weight. That's why people publish you. Doesn't it give you added responsibilities?
I would accept that.
I want to turn to another piece you wrote for the Sunday Times 6 weeks later. In it, you said, it's our business, not the state's, to say what risks we will take with our own health. You acknowledged that by going out and about, we may infect other people, but you said those who don't want to run the risk of being infected can isolate themselves voluntarily. You said that politicians were not wicked men, just timid ones, but you said it's a wicked thing that they're doing. Is it really wicked for governments to try to save people's lives?
I don't think that that is the effect of the lockdown, and I very much doubt whether they think so. The most important statement made in the now notorious Imperial College modelling report of the 16th of March, on the basis of which the lockdown decision was made, was this. What the report says is that lockdowns do not reduce the number of deaths. What they do is to spread them over a longer period. And the virus, once it's endemic, the virus rebounds whenever you lift them. That if you were going to have a lockdown, you needed to keep it in force until there was a vaccine in place, potentially 18 months or more. Now, I think most people would feel that the idea of a lockdown lasting 18 months was absolutely grotesque. But that was the logic. There are basically two rational positions that you can take about this. There's one qualification which I shall make in a moment. One is no lockdown, and the other is an everlasting lockdown until there is a vaccine, if there ever is, or if it is wholly effective over a considerable period of time. Now, there is one qualification that I need to make to that, which is that the idea of spreading the same number of deaths over a longer period does make some sense if the object is to enable the NHS intensive care capacity to catch up. And I recognize that that was a serious, a respectable argument in favor of the lockdown, but only for a relatively short period. Because one of the few things that the government deserves considerable credit for is the spectacular increase in the ICU capacity of the NHS over a very short period. Lockdown was imposed on the 23rd of March. The peak came in terms of hospitalizations on the 11th of April. And at that stage, the figures suggest that 42% of the ICU capacity of the NHS, and no more, was required for COVID-19 patients. So it's plain that the government did successfully surmount that problem and did so very quickly. Moreover, the Nightingale hospitals have stood empty virtually from the moment that they were created. The requisitioned private health facilities available have been unused until very recently, when they've started being used by the government for things other than COVID-19. So the capacity problem was dealt with, but the lockdown was continued on a different basis. We saw the end of the government's Save the NHS slogan, and thereafter it became simply locking us down for our own good. So that seems to me to be the point at which it lost any coherent justification.
So what you're really saying is that the lockdown went on for too long, perhaps a matter of weeks too long. Is that fair?
Well, I would say more than that. I recognize that for the first 3 weeks, there was a coherent, a respectable case for the lockdown. I don't regard it as justifiable even in that period for a different reason, which is that the cost was simply too high. The cost in other forms of health damage, the cost in economic terms, the cost in educational terms. It seems to me that one of the problems about the government's decision-making process is that at no stage until far too late was there any serious cost-benefit analysis. It is said that one minister at the Vital Cobra meeting, which authorized this at the last minute, said, well, what have we done in the way of cost-benefit analyses? And answer came there, none. And this seems to me to be a very serious criticism of a decision which has had such fundamental and costly effects. Not just costly, but costly primarily for those who are least vulnerable to the disease, because it is the young who are going to suffer by this, and the young who are not affected, say, marginally by the disease.
Well, you say the people who are least vulnerable to the disease, and on the day of your second Sunday Times piece, you did an interview with Michelle Hussein for the BBC, in which you said, for the overwhelming majority of people with no serious underlying conditions, this is a very mild epidemic. And your view was that people should be allowed to go to pubs and theatres if they wanted to at that time. And I think it's fair to say that you were arguing they could spread the virus around to anyone else who took the risk of going out on the basis that if they got the virus, it wouldn't do them much harm unless they were old and vulnerable.
Joshua, that's a bit of a distortion of my view.
Tell me.
What I was saying was that those who are vulnerable, those who do not wish to take the risk, can isolate themselves, and they would then be no worse off than the government forcibly isolating them, while those who were content to take the risk would be able to do that. If I sit next to, in the theatre to somebody who I infect, I am taking just the same risk of infection from him as he is from me. We both presumably consent to that. It's a matter of personal risk management. And to some extent, personal risk management is absolutely indispensable. The problem about law as an instrument for enforcing this kind of behavior is that individual circumstances are incredibly varied. The risk that one is taking depends on all sorts of things. How old am I? how important is what I wish to do that involves contact with other people? Do I have underlying health conditions? Have I had the disease already? However, law is pretty well by definition a one-size-fits-all approach, which ends up by banning many things that are perfectly harmless, because in some cases they might be harmful. And that is an extremely inefficient and despotic way of dealing with human beings.
But the logic of your position is not to use the law, simply to give people advice and allow them to decide for themselves. Surely it's the duty of a government to give a lead to people, because if you simply said, well, you know, if you feel ill or if you're a bit old, the figure of age 70 is quoted, you're 71, I'm 70, maybe we're old enough that we need to isolate, maybe we don't, it's very hard for us to judge. Unless the government actually gives a lead to people, then people aren't going to be able to do as you can, which is to think through it, to read the evidence, to read the expert reports. People expect the government to tell them what to do in a crisis.
I agree that that is the logic of my position, and I agree that the government should give a lead. But there's a world of difference between giving people a lead and fining them if they do anything different. It is absolutely right for the government to take advice and express the essence of that advice to the public and urge them to comply. That is what I call taking a lead. But using the criminal law as a way of criminalizing many things that are perfectly harmless seems to me to be a quite different thing. In the Sage minutes recording the advice given to ministers, there is, shortly before the lockdown occurred, a rather striking passage from the behavioral scientists saying it is necessary to treat people as grown-ups, to treat people as capable of making sensible decisions. Now, I quite see that to make sensible decisions, you need information. And what I mean by governments taking a lead is to give them the sensible information and enable them to make the necessary judgments.
You said to Misha Hussain that almost all the people who died of COVID-19 were very old and suffering from quite serious conditions. Now, I've given our respective ages. You're a year or so older than I am. We're in our early 70s. Are we very old?
Well, the relevance of age is that people who are old, and one can argue about when you become old, are more likely to have the underlying conditions which the COVID virus attacks. That's the relevance of age. There are plenty of people who are over 70 who do not have underlying conditions. Some of them may have underlying conditions of which they are unaware, though that, given the nature of the conditions in question, does not seem likely to apply to very many people.
Because the point you're making, and I'm sure you didn't mean to sound callous, was that these are people who are going to die anyway and going to die pretty soon, and they might as well, you know, die a few years earlier.
Well, they don't have to, because they can isolate themselves, as I suggested earlier. But I am perfectly happy to rise to the challenge of the rather tendentious way in which you put it back to me, which I do in this way. One, people can isolate themselves, as I have pointed out, and two, the government does need to be fairly hard-hearted about this. Everyone who dies of this disease or of any other cause is a personal tragedy for it's in their case and for those who are around them. But the government has to distance itself from that, because after all, 99 point something or other of people are not going to die of coronavirus, and most of them are not even going to get it. And the government has to have regard to the interests of the entire population, and not only those who are vulnerable. Now, there is, if you are going to respond to the danger to people who are vulnerable by locking down the entire population, including those who are not vulnerable, then it seems to me that you have a serious problem on your hands. You have to decide which of these groups, whose interests am I going to prefer? You don't need to make that decision if you allow people, with the information that you give them, to make sensible decisions in their own interest. We are not children. We are not to be infantilized by our government. And it seems to me that a democratic government cannot properly say to its people what this government has in substance said without using those words, namely, we think that you are too selfish, too stupid, too boneheaded, too inconsiderate to be trusted with a decision, and we are going to take it out of your hands and make that decision for you. That seems to me to be a monstrous thing for governments to do. Yet there is no other way of describing what they have done.
You see, you're very much out on a limb like this. I know you think that the politicians were, in many cases, too cautious to say this publicly, and they've told you this. But let's take this piece that Prospect published in response to your Sunday Times piece in May. This was from Thomas Poole, Professor of Law at the London School of Economics. He said you were asking the government to renege on its cardinal duty to ensure the safety of the public. He's right, isn't he?
No. I don't accept that safety first is a sensible maxim of policy. I think it's a good slogan, and it's the sort of slogan which it's sometimes hard to disagree with. But I am going to disagree with it for this reason. Whether safety first is a good policy depends on what you're putting second, third, and fourth. If what you're putting second, third, and fourth is the whole of our national life, economic, educational, cultural, then it seems to me that you have to ask yourself whether the price is worth paying. Now, different people will come to different conclusions about this. It's essentially a very difficult value judgment. But I don't accept that it is the cardinal duty of governments to save lives, if by that is meant at the expense of any other values whatever.
Can you think of a Western democracy that has followed the complete lockdown in the hope of keeping the economy going?
Well, I think that Sweden is probably the country that comes closest to it. And I mean, I can say a bit more about Sweden in a moment, but I mean, you're absolutely right to say that most European governments have done this. That most European governments have done this. But the problem is that would only be an impressive fact if each of them had independently arrived at this conclusion, having weighed the evidence and considered the cost against the benefits. The evidence is that that is not what happened. What actually happened was that each government in turn looked to others to do the same thing in order to give them political cover. I don't suppose for a moment that there would have been a lockdown in the UK if there hadn't already been a lockdown in Italy and France. And the government was therefore under enormous pressure to do what others had done, simply because others had done it, and because people expect the government to take action without actually asking themselves whether the action is useful. There has been a herd instinct among governments, just as there has been a herd instinct among people. We are finding even governments breaking ranks. A rather striking admission was made a few weeks ago by the Norwegian government that although they had had a lockdown, the lockdown could not, in hindsight, be said to have achieved anything of value, precisely because viruses like this don't go away, they are simply deferred if you lock people down. And they said that because they said, because of that, there is bound to be a second spike, and when it happens, we want people to understand why we're not going to lock them down again. Now, that was a courageous thing to say. It's about time we had a little more honesty from other Western governments.
I don't want to bandy statistics with you, as I promised, but there's just one that I do want to quote. Sweden has registered 55 deaths for every 100,000 people in the country, compared with 10 for Denmark and 4 for Norway. So maybe Norway was right.
Why are you comparing it with Norway and Denmark instead of with us?
All right. If you compare it with us, then the figure is much higher. The figure for the United Kingdom is certainly higher than many countries in the world.
Including Sweden.
Including Sweden. And the argument there is that the UK was too slow to lock down. It missed a couple of vital weeks.
Well, I don't accept that argument because it seems to me that the determinants of the death rate are not entirely but largely independent of government policy. This is a virus that attacks people with significant underlying conditions. I think everybody agrees about that. And the principal determinant of the number of deaths seems likely to be the underlying state of health of the population. In this country, the expectation of life is lower than the average for Western Europe. We have worse health conditions, particularly in the areas of obesity, where we have a worse record than any other country in Europe, apart from Malta. We have a worse record on cardiovascular disease. These are the kind of things that make people more vulnerable to dying from COVID-19.
Can I just return to the point you made about the idea that each democratic government is following the one before it, and that they all felt the need to do something? I mean, they could all be right, of course.
Yes, they could all be right. I have to say not, but they could be.
And whether they're right or not, that's their privilege as a democratic government, surely.
Certainly. I'm not criticizing France or Italy. They can make their own decisions. I think that they were probably unwise, but that's probably not for me to say. But I am entitled to criticize the English government for copying their example without going into the costs, in the broadest sense of the word costs, more carefully than they did, and without any kind of proper cost-benefit analysis.
One of the things that the government has done in England is to make face coverings mandatory on public transport, and from Friday, face masks will be required in shops and supermarkets. And obviously you're in England, you'll wear a mask when you go shopping, won't you?
Yes.
Even though you think there's no need to.
I didn't say that, and I don't think so.
I think there is a need to?
There is the evidence for and against the efficacy of wearing masks is very equivocal. And I am not going to pronounce on that at all. What I think about masks is that it is a relatively unimportant issue because it has no downside. It's mild inconvenience wearing a mask. It's slightly uncomfortable, but that's hardly a very serious objection to it. If masks encourage more people to come out and stop cringing in the face of this virus, then I think that that can only be to the good. So I'm not against masks at all, but the vital difference is that a lockdown has a very, very serious collateral effects in many directions. Whereas the worst thing that you can say about face masks is it's a bit of a nuisance. That isn't much of an argument.
I think we can agree that the UK government has handled this measure very badly. I've suggested to you that they imposed the restrictions too late. You've suggested to me that the restrictions carried on far too long. But you do agree with me that regulations made under the authority of Parliament should be obeyed, right or wrong, don't you?
I don't accept that there is a moral obligation to comply with the law. I do think that there is a civic obligation to comply with the law if you are satisfied with the way that the law has been made. I have certainly myself complied with the regulations until I came to the conclusion that they had gone on longer than even the government's own justification would support, when frankly I just stopped. So, you know, I certainly think that if you don't comply with the law, you cannot complain if you are fined. But are you committing a moral offence? I think not.
You've just said to me that you stopped complying with the law at some point, perhaps by going out, I don't know what.
Yes. I decided that I was no longer going to comply with some aspects of the law at a relatively late stage when it seemed to me to reach levels of absurdity where the government was simply continuing the regulations simply in order to avoid admitting that there had been respects in which they were not a very good idea to begin with.
So each of us can choose whether we wish to comply with the law of the land or not.
I think you've got to accept that if you make that choice, you may end up being punished, and you can't complain about that. I'm talking about moral obligation, not legal obligation.
Am I right in thinking that intentionally encouraging someone to commit a criminal offence can itself amount to a crime?
That is the law.
And if you say publicly, as you have today, that you've broken the law because you don't think you're under a moral obligation, you're not encouraging any individual to break the law, but you're letting people know that if you, Lord Sumption, can break the law, well, maybe they can too.
They can draw that conclusion for themselves if they want to. I don't accept that that would be an offence on my part.
Don't you think that you as a former Supreme Court judge have a duty to not only uphold the law, but set an example to others by obeying the law?
In some respects, yes. Though I think that as a former Supreme Court judge, I am simply a citizen. I may have a platform, but I have no juridical obligations by virtue of what I no longer do.
Isn't the right answer, when you think that the law is wrong, or maybe ministers have exceeded their powers in drawing up regulations, or that regulations are disproportionate, to take the government to court? And we have seen a businessman called Simon Dolan who belatedly launched a wide-ranging challenge to the lockdown regulations. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Justice Lewis refused him permission to apply for judicial review, subject to one or two outstanding issues. There's one pending challenge on religious assembly, but the courts aren't exactly giving the government a hard time on this one, are they?
No, they're not.
And you might have thought that claimants, you mentioned human rights organizations, would have been fighting for the right to challenge these regulations in the courts as they did over Brexit. But there's been hardly a squeak from anybody. What does that tell us?
Well, I think it tells us a number of interesting things. But first of all, it tells us something about the advocates of human rights who have been extraordinarily silent about the greatest infringement on human liberty which any British government has ever attempted, even in wartime. We have never attempted to place under house arrest, with very limited exceptions, the entire population. Secondly, I think that it shows, you said a moment ago that you thought that I was out on a limb on this. I think I'm less out on a limb than I was in the very early stages of the lockdown, but I would accept that the majority probably favour the lockdown. But that is, I'm afraid, how despotisms arise. Despotisms arise not because our liberty is forcibly taken away by tyrants, but because people voluntarily surrender their liberty in return for protection from some perceived threat. And it's in the interests of government to exaggerate that threat in order to procure compliance. That is what we have been seeing. What we have been seeing is a voluntary submission to an extraordinary regime, which, to my mind, has never been justified. I do not regard liberty as an absolute value, but I think it is a very great value. And I think that any deprivation needs to be justified far more effectively than any argument that the government has produced, either in this country or, for that matter, in any other of which I'm aware.
You say this is voluntary submission, and I'm going to suggest to you that these regulations have democratic legitimacy. It sounds to me as if you're saying the people have made the wrong choice. Let's sack the people and elect a new electorate.
I'm not saying that, but you are quite right to suggest that my criticisms are directed at least as much against my fellow citizens as they are against the government. I think that an earlier generation of Englishmen would not have tolerated this. I also think that they would have been right not to tolerate it.
Are you disappointed that there hasn't been a challenge in the courts? I mean, you said in your Reith lectures last year that the courts have developed a broader concept of the rule of law, which enlarges their own constitutional role. They've claimed a wider supervisory authority over other organs of the state. They've inched their way towards a notion of fundamental law overriding the political processes of the ordinary processes of political decision making. And these things have inevitably carried them into the realms of legislative and ministerial policy. To adapt the famous dictum of Clausewitz about war, law is the continuation of politics by other means. There's been absolutely no sign of that this year, has there?
Well, there are two major questions that would arise if there were to be a judicial review of the lockdown. One is whether the Public Health Act of 1984, as amended, actually empower the government to lock people down. That is a classic example of the kind of issue that courts have always decided, and I have absolutely no problem with the notion of the courts deciding that. The other, which is somewhat nearer the bone, is whether, in human rights terms, this was a proportionate response to the virus. Now, as I have said in other articles in papers, I think that the courts would probably, even in the current mood, run a mile before deciding that issue. What they would say is that there were some issues which were of such a technical nature that the government has to be allowed to make its own judgment about proportionality. So I don't think that the coronavirus issue is a very good test of the points that I was making. It is, however, a very striking indication of the points that I made in my first Reith lecture, which is, one of which was that the aversion of the population increasingly to any kind of risk and the demand for absolute security, or as close to absolute security as you can get, was an invitation to governments to exercise despotic power, which needed to be very carefully controlled, either by political or legal means. I thought political means were better. Now, that proved to be remarkably prescient, because it's exactly what is happening now.
Well, let's bring the discussion...
And fear is what is driving this.
Okay, one more question before I move on. I want to bring the discussion completely up to date with the stories today about the possibility of a vaccine. And there's a column in the Times today, I won't mention the author's name, but she raises concerns that even if a coronavirus vaccine is developed, up to a quarter of the population might refuse to take it. Would that worry you?
I think that that's a decision that they have to make. I would take it.
But if people don't take it, if a quarter don't, we won't get the herd immunity that you wrote about in your first Sunday Times piece, and the vaccine won't be effective. What should the government do?
That's actually not right. I mean, there are different views about what proportion of the population needs to be immune in order to have herd immunity. The general consensus is somewhere around the 60% mark. In addition, there appear to be reasons for supposing that this particular virus, one against which some people, for reasons not fully understood, have a natural immunity without being exposed to it. So I think factually the premise of your question may be wrong.
Okay.
But you can't force people to vaccinate themselves.
But you'd encourage them. The government should have an education.
I think it would be sensible to that. If a vaccine was available which had passed the quite exacting tests which have to be satisfied before a vaccine is allowed to be marketed, if that condition is satisfied, I think that it would be sensible to be vaccinated and foolish not to be.
Okay, please stay there for a moment, Lord Sumption, because I want to bring in our second speaker, Judge Anne Claire Williams, who is of counsel at Jones Day. Anne Williams was nominated by President Ronald Reagan to the District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, making her the first woman of color to serve on the Seventh Circuit. 15 years later, she was nominated to the Circuit's Court of Appeals, the first judge of color to sit on that court, and only third black woman to serve on any federal circuit court. She served for 18 years on that court before retiring as a judge and joining Jones Day, where she heads the law firm's work in advancing the rule of law in Africa. She is an inspirational figure. She's committed to public interest work, mentoring, supporting a new generation of human rights lawyers. Judge Williams, thank you for joining us. Just one quick question to begin with. What is the situation in Illinois? Not as many deaths as New York and New Jersey, but not very far behind Massachusetts and California. Is that right?
Yeah, in Illinois, our governor locked down pretty early, and the mayor in Chicago locked down fairly early. So we're one of those states. We have a slight incline, but things are going relatively well here in Illinois, unlike the rest of the country, or many parts of the country, the South and the West, where there were lockdowns, but the lockdowns, in my opinion, ended too quickly. And now we have huge explosions now in those areas. We are now at a death toll of 140,000, and the speculation is it will be 200,000. We have 3.7 million with the COVID virus, and it's rising in 31 states, and deaths are rising in 20 states. You know, my view is it's this lack of a national mandatory approach to dealing with COVID that's helped put us in this spot, because essentially it's been left to the states to decide. Our Center for Disease Control has given guidelines, but they're not mandatory guidelines. And I think the federal government really has an obligation, responsibility to ensure of its citizens to regulate and restrict firms, to protect all of us. I think that's the essence of a democratic society. I think it is a key proponent. And I think there are some dangers when you're in this kind of situation, because if government oversteps the bounds, that's a problem. Oversteps the bounds and gives orders that are not based, it's not real, not fortunate. When there's poor planning and poor public policy, and also the issue of pushing political agendas can creep into this. We saw a little of this in the United States with the international students, when the administration banned international students from attending college if the classes were not live. If they were virtual, their visas were not going to be renewed. They had to go back. But there's been pushback on that. But that's an example of overstepping. I know Lord Sumption is concerned about government overstepping, but the people reacted to that, and that's been a pushback. But that's certainly a risk.
Okay, well, that's really what I wanted to come on to. I mean, I infer from what you're saying about the United States that you would disagree with the views that Lord Sumption has expressed as far as the United Kingdom is concerned.
Yes, I would, because I think that we have to balance human life with those economic considerations. We have thousands dying here daily. I think I guess I'd put it this way: the real threat to the economy, in my view, is the virus itself, not the lockdown measures. Even though I understand that the lockdown measures do threaten the economy, but I don't see how we come out with a good economy, how we regrow the economy when the virus is spreading. If we don't have appropriate restrictions, the disease will inevitably affect so many essential sectors. How we survive: food providers, health professionals, sanitation workers, transportation and energy suppliers, they have to go to work. But if the virus isn't controlled, they're vulnerable. Also, there's certain groups that are vulnerable, those underrepresented groups, Blacks, Browns, people who have traditionally been left out in our society, very vulnerable. They can't do, as Lord Sumption was saying, sort of these choices he's saying that people can make. They don't really have real choices, those workers. And when we look at Sweden, which you mentioned, they didn't lock down their restaurants or gyms or anything like that. And now their economy is not stable. But when we look at Denmark did a swift lockdown, and they did tracing. And I think that's the situation with Germany as well. I think Lord Sumption was saying, you know, as long as we have hospital facilities and everything, and we can accommodate, we have more beds. I mean, there's also an assumption that if you have a good medical system, a lockdown doesn't have to be as long. So let's take Germany. They basically closed for several weeks, but what did they have? They had a track and trace approach. It helped to keep deaths down. They have a very good, very well-funded health system. So there were beds for people. They were able to test people quickly. And so Germany is doing much better. We started behind the 8 ball here in the United States with an administration that really didn't take, in my view, the virus very seriously. And we don't have any kind of uniform policy, so it's each state for themselves.
Okay,
and that's why we're in the mess we're in.
I want to come on to the government side of it. Would you say that the pandemic has affected the rule of law in the United States? Would you say that it's affected democracy? And what effect is it going to have on the presidential elections, which are coming up later this year?
Well, I definitely think it has affected our democracy, and I think it's affected the rule of law. And I'll point to one area that I believe it's really having an impact, and that's on voting. The election is coming up, and voting, of course, is a vital piece of the democratic process. After the lockdown, registration drives were closed. There were primaries after the lockdown, and there were fewer volunteers. Most of the volunteers are older. There were fewer polling stations. You may have seen the long lines for people waiting to vote. To protect the right to vote, I think Congress needs to fund more money to make sure voting goes the way it should in this country. I think you're going to see more people who want to vote by mail because they don't want to stand in line because of the risks. We need to ensure that we have online registration for voting, and we need to lift the restrictions on vote by mail. And part of what has come up in this whole voting by mail is a chance of fraud, but there was a commission appointed by this administration that didn't find any evidence of fraud. The Brennan Center ran a study, and it found 0.0004% to 0.0009% evidence of fraud. So virtually no evidence of fraud. That's one of my biggest concerns in terms of this COVID, using COVID as a way to somehow suppress the vote for the upcoming national election and other elections.
Judge Williams, I've just got one more question to ask you, and it was the question I asked Lord Sumption, and somebody has put in a question on the Q&A about this, and it's about face masks. And this questioner suggests that face masks have been made a political issue in the United States, a left-right issue. What's your view about face masks? Should they be made compulsory?
I think they should be made compulsory. I also agree it's become a political issue, but our CDC said April 3rd that face masks would be helpful. And I think when you see states or cities where the citizens complied with that, you see a better result. When it was mandated, you see a better result. And you're seeing now with our large corporations like Walmart, our supermarkets, anywhere you're going into a public space, they're making it mandatory to wear face masks. And the other thing is, we've always had regulations that related to even clothing. You've seen those signs perhaps in the UK, no shoes, no shirt, no service. Why? Because those present health risks. People have to be appropriately managed. That certainly was an infringement upon individual rights. We look at the balance to the health and safety and comfort and liberty of others. Those are bans that have been put in place. And so I think face masks are really critical. And let's look at Taiwan and Japan, places where, for example, Taiwan, there was a little shutdown, but basically the government said, wear face masks, follow social distancing rules, don't get involved in don't go to huge gatherings. And so Taiwan pretty much has been working the way it should. People are going to their jobs.
Okay. Judge Williams, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry to cut you off there. Judge Anne Claire Williams, thank you. I want to come back to Lord Sumption, if I may now, because we only have 10 minutes left. And Lord Sumption, I want to put to you one of the points that Judge Williams made, which is that the real threat to the economy is the virus rather than the lockdown. What's your response to that?
Well, can I first of all say that I think, with respect, Judge Williams has not answered the big problem about the lockdown, which is that it doesn't reduce the number of deaths, but merely spreads them over a longer period. That is the absolutely critical factor. You could have an earlier lockdown, and unless it's indefinitely in place, you're still going to have substantially the same number of deaths. But let me turn to the point about the underlying problems. It is absolutely true that some people don't have a choice. They are the people who cannot work from home, who are performing essential services. Now, in every country which has locked down, as far as I'm aware, there have been exceptions for people whose work is vital to enable the infrastructure of the country to proceed. Even Spain, which had the most severe lockdown of any country that I know, accepted people who had to be there in order to do the essential work. So the people who have no choice whether we have a lockdown or not. Now, we in this country have one earlier experience of this kind of problem, which does not bear out Judge Williams' predictions. It's the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 to 1921. Spanish flu had a much higher infection rate and a lower infection rate, but a much higher mortality rate than COVID-19. Spanish flu is estimated to have killed 200,000 people in the UK in a population which was about 2/3 of the size of the UK population now. Spanish flu had a very limited effect indeed on the functioning of the economy and no effect on the functioning of basic services. None of the predictions made as to the effect of we didn't have a lockdown, none of the predictions made about the effect of not locking down on the availability of basic services were borne out by that experience. And the same experience can be found in the United States, where rather more measures were taken than were taken in Europe to contain Spanish flu.
Well, that brings me to a question from Maxwell Short. He says that the media has been highly critical of President Trump and the US response to the crisis, but it seems to this viewer that you would approve of the approach taken by the US federal government under President Trump. Is that right?
Well, President Trump has a justifiably poisonous reputation in many fields. But you know, President Trump believes, I dare say, that 3 + 2 is 5. I don't see any need to say that it's 6 just in order to differentiate myself. I think that President Trump has been an extraordinarily unhelpful influence about this. He has made some extreme and extravagant remarks, some very foolish statements indeed about the appropriate remedies. I think that the jerkiness of his response has been almost totally unhelpful. I also don't accept his view that this is not a problem at all. I think that one's got to understand the nature of the problem and the relative efficiency of the various different ways of doing it. So I'm not approving of President Trump's views, but I do take the view that the extent of the danger in this country has been grossly exaggerated, and that the alleged remedy is not a remedy at all, and it's on any view way over the top.
Lord Sumption, I don't want to get tied up with the subject of face masks, but there are two questions from two readers. One of them says, this is Jonathan McGinley, face masks are more than just inconvenient, they're unhygienic, they may trap the virus. The government making them mandatory as a diktat, so this person, Jonathan McGinley, is against it. And Gavin Chesney says that you support face masks because the downside is so negligible. Doesn't that apply equally to vaccination? Or are you against vaccination because of it possibly carrying a small risk of side effects, and therefore it's unacceptable to impose vaccinations, whereas it is acceptable to impose face masks?
Well, I do not yet know, none of us do, whether there are disagreeable collateral effects from vaccination. I have said that if the vaccine is safe, which I think we can assume it will be if it passes the rigorous tests that have to be satisfied before marketing, we can assume that there will be no significant adverse side effects. That's certainly the basis on which I would assess the risks for myself. So I don't think that there is a significant downside. As to face masks, I know that there is a case for saying that they are positively harmful. I know that there is a case for saying they are positively helpful. And the fact that the World Health Organization has espoused both views successively in the course of this crisis does not exactly inspire confidence. But it seems to me that the balance of the evidence is pretty inconclusive, and that the advantages in encouraging people to go out and resume something resembling their normal life are well worth the risks.
Lord Sumption, we've almost come to the end, and I haven't given you a chance to to answer the question posed in the subject of this debate. This question about whether the law and the flyer, this is, rather than the title. Last year you complained about the courts, this year you've complained about the government, and the question really is, are democracy and the rule of law both at risk, or should we be grateful that we have judges who are willing to be proactive in defending individual rights, and politicians who can act dramatically and swiftly, even if you would say misguidedly, to safeguard the public good as they see it?
Well, I have not suggested that the government has acted undemocratically in imposing the lockdown. What I have suggested is that they have acted unnecessary, contrary to basic principles which attach high importance to liberty. I am struck by the fact that it is political opinion rather than legal opinion that is left to defend liberty. And I have been acting, I suppose, politically rather than legally in criticizing the government for what it has done. And I am entirely unashamed of that.
But it's strange, isn't it? You were attacking the courts last year for going too far, and this year you're attacking, and you were saying that the courts should have deferred to the government. This year you're attacking the government, which was the body that you were attacking last year.
I still think that on the issue of COVID-19, the courts should defer to the government when it comes to the assessment of proportionality. They should not defer to the government when it comes to deciding whether it is within the powers conferred by the Public Health Act. So I don't believe that there is any actual change in my position. But remember that when I criticized the courts for exceeding their mandate, I was not seeking to protect the interests of the executive. I was seeking to protect the interests of the legislature. I am a strong believer in parliamentary government. And that is the reason why I think that the courts have gone too far. I have no particular interest in protecting the prerogatives of the executive.
But nevertheless, the government was acting within the laws laid down by Parliament.
Well, I think that's arguable, actually.
Really?
But that's another argument which it's not sensible 3 minutes before the end of this programme to embark on. But I think that it's highly debatable whether the Public Health Act does actually authorise this. However, we shall see.
Well, we may not see, because nobody's brought a challenge. And as I say,
I understand that Mr. Dolan is appealing for leave.
All right, well,
I must say I find it astonishing that this is not regarded as an arguable proposition, whatever you think the answer might be. I think it's genuinely difficult.
Well, we'll see what the Court of Appeal said. I mean, one of the problems that concerned Mr. Justice Lewis was delay.
Yes, well, that is a serious problem. Mr. Dolan should have acted a lot sooner.
And it's surprising, as I say, that nobody else did. I think that we have actually, by my clock anyway, reached past. So I want to thank you, Lord Sumption. I want to thank Prospect Magazine, who are going to publish a recording of this debate between us. I want to thank the Bingham Centre, who had the idea. I want to thank Jones Day. Above all, I want to thank Judge Anne Claire Williams and Lord Sumption. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching. It says 439 participants on my screen at the moment, but that's the end of this discussion. Thank you and goodbye.